Good morning, I'm Angus at LabVac, and today up on the bench I have a Pfeiffer DUO 2.5 little tiny vacuum pump. These are commonly found on the back of laboratory instruments, so they generally tend to be quite clean when they come in. We're going to do a full strip down and it'll go off and get cleaned and prepped, and then I'll come back and do a rebuild later on. So to get into this one, I've drained the oil already. I'm going to tip it up onto the motor and get the base plate out of the way first of all. If you do find these videos useful, there's quite a few of them up on the channel now, more to come. I would be very grateful if you would click like and perhaps consider subscribing. We're not monetized, so it doesn't make any difference from that point of view, but what it does do is help to get the videos promoted by YouTube out to a few more people. So having done that, next thing I want to do is take the motor off. Now, slightly unusually with these pumps, you have 4 bolts up here. 2 of them hold the oil box on, 2 of them hold the motor on. So I'm going to take away the 2 that hold the motor. Start to strip the pump down. Get those 2 out of the way. And then we should be able to split the motor. These can be on there pretty tight and a little bit tricky to get it to release. As is the case here. Let's add a little persuasion. And then take a marginally more subtle approach. Having opened a little gap there, I can hopefully get some leverage under there. There we go. Get our motor out of the way, so we've got a felt pad there to soak up the oil leaks. As you'll know, I'm not a great advocate of a felt pad, but I'm not the manufacturer, I'm just repairing the thing. So a new one will go in. There's a motor which feels nice and smooth. I'll give that a test off camera before it goes back on, but for the time being I'll get that out of the way. So then what we've got is a very compact little 2.5 cubic meter per hour vacuum pump. Next step is to take the oil box off there by taking out the other 2 screws. Come off nice and easily, which tells me clean pump. So that's the old cork gasket for the oil box. And then we've got our pump mechanism. So It's a two-stage pump, so we've got two pumping stages here, an end plate, and then we have this contraption perched on top which does all of the oil control, anti-stuck back control and so on. Removal of it, we've essentially got two bolts that hold the pump mechanism onto the adapter plate, three here that hold the valving onto the plate, and then one down the middle here which holds the valving onto the pump mechanism. So dismantling is quite straightforward. We can take all of those out and it will come apart. Later on, when we go to put it back together, you have to get all of the surfaces to come together. They're all O-ring sealed to each other, so you have to get all of them to come together. Which takes a little bit of finessing, with it being mounted in multiple directions. So that will free that. It won't come apart just yet. The easiest thing to do is to take everything out. A couple of long screws that go right the way through the pump body into the adapter. Now with everything free, that will all come away and we can start to see what's there. So this is our adapter plate. We've got a shaft seal in the back there that needs to come out, and our gas ballast assembly up on the side. That little piece that fell out there is a coupling plate which sits between the shafts of the motor and the pump. This is our valving section, and then that's our little pumping module with 1-2 stages. It's interesting to note that this pump works in the opposite way round to most of them. Most of the pumps we look at, gas flow comes into the pump and then through this stage and through this stage. This one is reversed. It goes into the pump right the way through this block and then into the pumping stage, this being the first stage, second stage, and then final gas releases from here. Doesn't really make a massive amount of difference to what we're doing, but it's interesting to see that it's different. So starting with the valve block, you can see underneath here we've got an O-ring that seals it onto the pump body, so that will come out. My little bit of advice with dismantling is keep all the parts, keep everything that you take out until you're back at the reassembly stage, just in case anything is not in the kit that you thought was going to be. So there's the end plate there. Now theoretically there should be an O-ring here. It looks like there might have been one, but it's completely disintegrated. It's extremely small. Oftentimes it doesn't appear to be there at all. When we come to reassemble, we should have one in the kit that'll go into there. In all honesty, I think the pump works perfectly well, even if that is missing. So there's our oil control valve and spring. Got another O-ring seal that sits around there. very worn. I'm using a metal pick here. You might want to use a plastic pick, although they do tend to give up before the O-ring comes out. You don't want to scratch any surfaces here. So that's that end of the unit, and then the anti-suck back valve face is up here with another spring, and then behind it there is a pad that it seals against, which is also critical there. That's the dismantling of our block, and then again in the anti-suck back device we have a couple more O-rings that will need to come out of there on either side. That's that section. The rubber pad on here is bonded, so we don't touch that. Then we can move on to the pump mechanism itself. Get rid of a bit of that oil. This is doweled together, so having taken those two bolts out that hold it to the adapter, there's nothing else holding this other than the dowels. But those dowels tend to be very tight indeed. A little O-ring there that we can remove for starters. We can take the valves off with a 3mm Allen key. Put those in a little pot. So we've got obviously the screw there, then there's a backing plate. And then the valve itself is this tiny little spring steel plate. There's no intermediate valve between the two stages on this pump because the way it's constructed, the flow rate of both stages is identical. They're both the same size. So look at that. That's the tiny O-ring that goes in the back of there. So we did have one. Let's pop that over there. Yeah, so the two stages are the same size, so there's no intermediate valve. It's just that final valve. Now we have to separate these sections. Now, there are options with this. You could put it through the ultrasonic bath like that, which will loosen things up. The alternative method is to be a little bit more brutal with it and to carefully tap the sections apart. So I'm going to put a drift, or in this case a screwdriver, onto there. Palm of my hand is holding it to the bench. Now I'll give it a tap and it will start to come apart. So inside of there, this is our stator. The rotor should now lift out. Again, this one's a little bit sticky, but there we go. So rotor and stator, got a pair of vanes with springs, and then we've got an end plate on there which also needs to come off. And I'm going to tackle that with a seal driver. I don't want to go into there with the screwdriver really, because that's actually the internal sealing surface that I've got to drive now. So hammering onto that with anything other than a fully flat-faced seal driver is going to leave marks. that I don't want. Now I could turn this round and try and hold this and tap from there. I think it's going to be easier to hold it that way. Give it a tap and you can see that that's released. A few more taps and there we go. So they're the dowels. One stayed on there, one stayed on there. And that's what's holding it together. So there's a little bit of dirt build up in here. Nothing spectacular, that'll clean up very well. Then we need to do the same centre bearing section. Out of there. So there's our gas path through between the two stages, and the large hole there is our inlet gas path, which, as I say, runs right the way through into this hole here, through that section, through there, and into the stator of what is effectively our first pumping stage, all being the wrong way round, if you like. And we can take the other end plate off there. There's our second pumping stage stator end plate and the rotor and vanes. And there's a spring stuck in there. So just to illustrate, you can see the vanes in the two stages are identical in size, hence not needing that interstage pressure relief valve. The rotors themselves differ in that this one is driven from the motor, so that's where that little metal plate sits in between and provides the coupling between those. And then once the pump's assembled, that will be sitting on those two dowels inside there within the centre bearing and coupling the drive through. And then the last little piece to come out of there, which is very easy to overlook because you can barely see it, is the oil pump vane, which is there. So that's our oil pump vane, which spins around inside here, picks up oil from the sump and circulates it through the pump. So a very compact, relatively straightforward pump. Like I say, reassembly is slightly complicated by the way that the valve block is assembled and has to be sealed against two directions simultaneously. But I'll take all this away, clean it all up. Because it's in good condition at the moment, this will be relatively straightforward. So I'll probably get an hour through the ultrasonic bath, and then I'll bring it all back and we can look at reassembling. Okay, here we are back at the bench with our Pfeiffer DUO 2.5, everything cleaned and ready to rebuild. I've laid everything out, and the first thing I'm going to do is put all these tiny parts in a pot so that I don't drop any. I've covered up the drain in my bench, but it's still safer to just keep all of these somewhere where I can keep an eye on them. Okay, get things out of the way. Now, I didn't come back and talk about the gas ballast on this pump, so I'll do that now. This control on the side is the gas ballast. On this particular model of pump, as is quite common, there's a screw been fitted here. It's factory fit. A screw put in there so that this can't be moved, so it's closed all the time. 0 lined up with 0 means off. So I don't really need to do anything with that because it's fully closed and that's that. But what I would say is the hardware on here is absolutely minuscule. To take this apart, you need to remove the fixing screw there, which is a 2mm Allen key job. This one does come out. I took it out. And indeed, I can show you that. So that's that fixing screw coming out. With that removed, this control is now free to rotate. So one lined up with one means gas ballast is on, and that's gas ballast is off. The next thing you need to do, if you need to dismantle this, is to take the red rotatable part off here, the knob, which again is 2mm, and on this pump is completely rounded out already, which is hardly surprising because hardware that small just doesn't survive being used. So I can't take this off without probably destroying that screw. You have to take that off to access these two bolts underneath, which again need a 2mm Allen key, and that lets you take the whole thing out. What I can do though is turn that to open. This is where the gas ballast comes through. I'll take some aerosol solvent and spray a little bit up there, and what I'm looking for is to see that I get the spray coming out through here, which will tell me that I've got a clear path through there, like that. You'll also get a jet out of here, which is also connected. What that tells me is that the path through there is clear. If someone did want to use this gas ballast, they can, it works. And with that, I'm going to put it back how it was and leave it alone. Given that this user obviously has this locked off and isn't going to be touching it, that's sufficient for me to move on. I can do an update if anybody really needs it with a pump that will come apart, but I don't want to destroy this one just for the purposes of the video when the owner of this pump has no intention of ever using that gas ballast control. So enough said. Okay, so always a good point to look at what's actually come in your kit. I've got a new felt, I've got a bag of O-rings, which we'll get to in a moment, and I've got 2 oil box gaskets. This is quite common with vacuum pumps. What happens is over years and years of production, tweaks and changes get made that are subtle, and rather than have to account by serial number for exactly which kit will go with which pump that's out in the field, they'll put all the possible parts into the kit. So you'll end up with things like this, where obviously the oil box gasket has changed. Looking at these, it's really difficult to see the difference. What's actually different here is the cut-off on this corner is slightly larger on one than the other. Because you kept all the parts when you took your pump apart, the easiest way to go about it is to just line it up. And then you can immediately see that this is the gasket that is going to fit the particular pump that I've got here. That one can go away, and that's the one that we're going to use. If your gasket was well and truly stuck in the pump and destroyed, again, it's not going to be that difficult. It just means that you need to compare it to the parts that it's being fitted to. The difference is going to be the cutout across that corner. So you just have to work that out. But worth mentioning that you often get that situation where you've got parts left over at the end of a rebuild, and it's usually because the kit covers multiple models or multiple years of manufacture. So that said, we can move on to putting this back together. So I'll open up the bag of new seals that we've got, of which there are many more than I remember taking out. So we'll work through these and see exactly what we've got. These three I immediately recognise KF16 O-rings, so they've been provided so that you can have a new seal on the inlet and exhaust of the pump. Why we've got three, I'm not sure. More than likely just a picking error. We have the outer shaft seal, which is the only shaft seal in this pump, and that's going to sit in here. So we can begin by doing the obvious parts. That's going to sit in there, and it wants to end up flush with the housing. So the best way to get that to sit flush is to use an oversized driver. So I'm going to go for a large size driver, much bigger than the seal, and that means that as I hammer it home, the driver will end up sitting on the metal and the seal will be flat underneath it. So I've pushed that in by hand, leaving a good sort of 3 or 4 millimeters sticking up. And then I'm going to put this, unfortunately it'll be off camera, I need to put it on a bench. If I start hammering things on here, all this lot's going to go, which is not helpful to us. So I'm just sitting that over the seal, as I say. Couple of taps home. And then what I've got is the seal sat in there. It's equal all the way around because it was driven home against that surface. So that's my outer shaft seal taken care of. And then we need to go through and identify the rest of the O-rings that we've got. We've got a large brown seal there. That's for the sight glass on the oil box. This pump is very, very clean, so I'm not proposing to change that in this instant. There's no sign of it leaking. There's no reason it's going to start to leak from the service. And I don't need to take the sight glass out to clean it because it's already pretty clean. So then I've got the O-ring that sits in there, which is going to seal the valve block onto the pump mechanism. I've got an O-ring that sits around there. Now I've got a number of O-rings of very similar sizes. So what I want to do is pop them in, make sure that they sit. So I've got two that are a similar size to that. Both seem to be tight on there. Doesn't mean they're wrong. They may need to be stretched a little, but I just want to identify whether they would go anywhere else, like on the back of here, and whether I've got one that fits there and one that doesn't. So I've got the same situation there, that they're popping back out. So what I'm going to do is just gently stretch the O-ring. Don't go too tough on this and end up breaking it. These are only about 1.5 millimeter section O-rings, so it doesn't take a lot to stretch them out. There you go. And then once that's sat in the groove, that's not going to go anywhere. Same with this one then. A little bit of a stretch. And it sits in there happily. Okay, and I do have my tiny O-ring that sits in here. I'm going to leave that safely on the bench until I actually need to assemble that. So then I can return to the inlet valve. That gets a new seal there. That will end up sat in there. The pump body itself wasn't O-ring sealed, so there's nothing going in there. That section goes with that. I do have on the adapter plate here a small O-ring that needs to sit in there. It looks about that size. So there we go, we're off to a good start. Now some of these other O-rings are going to be underneath in the gas ballast assembly that we're not messing with. So we're going to have some leftovers. The other things I've got is my drain plug, which needs a new O-ring. That's going to sit on there, and then be screwed back into the oil box. Go ahead and do that now. Make sure that feels like I've got a good seal on it. O-ring sealed plugs like that don't need a lot of force on them. The O-ring will seal perfectly well. And if you do put a huge amount of force onto it, you're more than likely going to damage the seal rather than make it work better. So that's my fill plug. That also gets a new seal on it. It goes into the top of the oil box. I'm not even going to bother tightening that one up now, because obviously that's going to need to come out to fill the pump when it's back together. So I still have a range of O-rings here. Let's not get too bogged down with those, eh? I'm not going to go through and identify absolutely everything. I'm going to work out what I need as it goes together by checking the faces that I'm assembling. So we can start then to assemble the pump cartridge. Personally, I like to work off a flat surface, so I'm going to start with the end plate, which has nothing on the end of it, so that can sit down flat. So I'm assembling perhaps in reverse if you like, but hey, I'm doing the work, I can make the decisions. So we're going to have a rotor attached to that. This is vacuum pump oil, Supervac 19, which I use for everything that doesn't need something special. So it's not manufacturer specific. I'm going to put that down in there, make sure that's sat down nicely and turns freely. That's good. Then I need a pair of vanes. The vanes need springs, and we're working with tiny components. So what I am going to do, I keep picking it up and moving it. I'm just going to put a rag over the drain holes in this bench, because these parts are small enough to fall through. Springs are conjoined. So the springs sit in there. These vanes are not directional in any way. I have checked that they've got a good face on them. In fact, these are so good that I haven't even needed to hone these ones. Give them some oil. And slot them through the rotor. All good. If anything feels tight or it binds or it stops, don't force it. Take it apart, have a look, work out what's catching, rehome the surface, whatever's necessary so that they fit together nicely. Especially these very small pumps, it's easy to actually damage the components just because they've got so little material to them. So then we need our stator, which is going to go onto here. Now if we need to look at, muddled all the parts up, a bit like that card trick, you've got to figure out how everything's working, how it fits together. The way that this sits, the gas flow is going to come in through here from the port. It comes down through this hole here, fill with my finger, which is then O-ring sealed onto this section here, which tells me that that sits there. That's the one with the final exhaust valve as well. So the stator that I need is that one. Then the flow through the body, so once the gas flow comes down through this port, it comes out of there, it will go through the corresponding port in the centre here, so it's not going into the pump mechanism here, it's travelling straight the way through there, and it will travel then into the corresponding port on that stator that we're about to install, which is there. Okay, so now I've completely oriented it, I know which way up it needs to be. The end plate sits on this side, so I'm going to install that away. Okay, I've got a dowel already in this side and one over here, which is also a good indicator that that's the direction that I'm installing. But just by following the logical gas path, you can figure out quite easily A, which part it is that you're looking to install, and B, the orientation that it needs to be in. So those then will press together like that. See, when the parts have all been cleaned, they go together relatively easily. If you haven't done such a good job on cleaning, you might find that a little tap here and there to push things home is necessary, but hopefully not. So there we go, that's the first two components assembled. We then need to add the centre bearing. Now I'm going to make sure that this is well lubricated. The shaft sits through here, so I want to make sure that that's lubricated in there. And I also just want to make sure that there's a film on that surface. Don't need a lot there, but that will just help the two sections to seal against each other. Okay, my dowel pins are now here and here, and that can be installed over there. Line up the dowels, which is easier done when you can see them. Push it home. There we go. So I've got my first rotor and stator section assembled. I can now add the second rotor. I've got to line up the dowels that are in the first one into the holes that are in this one. Just filled with oil, making it more difficult for you to see. And that will drop in there, and then with a gentle rotation you find where those dowels sit down, and that's in. Two more vanes. More oil. those through, check that all the movement is as we like it to be. And then again, I'm just going to make sure that I've got some oil to seal those surfaces and lubricate. And then what I'm doing here is I'm holding the stator thus, and then I'm going to use these two fingers just to compress the vanes together against the springs just to get it started into there. Make sure that's all lined up. Push it home. Okay, looking good. Then I need the oil pump vane. Probably the most common forgotten piece, but the whole pump, not only will it not work without the oil pump, it'll actually destroy itself pretty quickly if it doesn't get any oil. You don't want to overlook that. And then the final part here is going in. Now this one, again, it is doweled. It will only go in the correct orientation, but in order to double check that I'm doing things right, again, I'm going to look here. That's where it assembles to. Got two holes there that correspond to the two pathways there. So that's the correct way up for it. Transfer that onto here. All just confirms that everything is as it should be. And that's the cartridge back together. So the last few things that I've got in my pot are the exhaust valve. So the exhaust valve sits there. It's going to be really difficult to see, but there's a tiny nick out of the top of it there that corresponds to a very small roll pin that's factory installed there. So that orientates it. And then when the screw goes down through here, that will lock it into place. The backing plate goes on top of that. And then the screw goes down through both of those. Now because it's got that roll pin on the back, that will keep it, it'll be in the correct orientation. So I can just tighten that down without needing to worry about watching its position over the hole. Okay, again, don't need a lot of torque on that. It's a very, very small screw. It'd be very easy to round it out, cause yourself more trouble. So, as I said when I took this thing apart, reassembling the valve block and the cartridge back onto the adapter plate is a little bit of a finessing thing. Now, that's straightforward. That sits there, nice and easy. We do have to have the coupling in there as well. The problem is that if you bolt that right down, then getting this to sit on top of it and get a seal in both directions can be a bit tricky. So you need to do kind of everything all at the same time at this stage. So we'll go for reassembling the valve block so that that's at least ready. And in order to do that, we can start with the plunger. Now this, I didn't boil this in solvent to clean it. I've left it pretty much as it is. I've given it a wipe down and made sure it's clean. It's absolutely critical, this component. It's a very complex rubber moulding, and if If it has any damage to it, then it's not a part of the kit. You're going to have to get a new one. So that sits in that side, and we'll have this plate covering over it. The bolts that hold the plate on are also what holds the thing together. So that's ready to assemble. And then on the flip side we have the bonded seal, which sits inside there. It should drop down easily. The spring sits onto that and actually sits around the rubber plate on there. And then the inlet valve with its O-rings sits inside the spring. So that whole assembly sits like that. And the non-return valve there sits inside the cavity in there. So that's how those parts go together. We then need to put the plunger back in at the back, and then we need to add the very, very small O-ring that just sits in that countersunk hole there, and then this plate will go over the top, trapping that, and that is the point that the little O-ring is sealing against. Okay, and then we need 3 screws that hold that in place. And I'm going to loosely assemble that. But we also have to get the cartridge in simultaneously, as I say. So if you do either one before the other, it causes a problem, because I now don't have room for that to sit in. So we need to bring this back, and we need to mount it over the inlet. I need to take that plunger back out again for a moment. I'm trying to sort of demonstrate the level of complexity that's required to reassemble this. So we've got a bolt that goes straight down through the middle there. That holds the two together. And again, we can start this bolt through here to assemble the two. But what we can't do is bolt that down, because if those are tight together, then they may not be in the correct position so that the seals operate onto the adapter plate surface. So I'm just going to start that. It's not tight. And then I'll need to bring both of these simultaneously onto here. Without that happening. So with both of those sat home, you can see I've still got quite a lot of movement here in all these parts. So I can return to this. Right, so with those two loosely attached, I can offer up the whole section onto the adapter plate. And the inlet valve goes there, and I can bring all of that together. So you can see there's still a lot of play in all directions at this point. So I can drop the two long bolts down through that attach the pumping cartridge to the adapter and just make sure that those are lined up, which they're not at the moment. So there we go, 1 and 2, again leaving them loose at this stage, and then I can reassemble the spring and plunger, return the tiny O-ring, can't even pick up at the moment, back into its recess, and then I can put this end plate on. I want to be careful that that plunger sits in properly without catching or damaging. So just let that across there to hold it in place. Make sure my tiny O-ring is still where it should be, and then drop the 3 bolts through to hold that in place. You see those don't immediately line up, so they're through the body, they're not lining up with the holes on the adapter plate. So another little jiggle is required. Okay, so now got everything loosely fitted. So I need both sections to be bolted flush down onto the adapter plate, but I also need the 2 sections to be bolted through to each other so that I've got a good seal between them. So with all the bolts loosely fitted, I can now go in and start to tighten down. And I kind of want to tighten all of them simultaneously. So I just work round. And that should give me a simultaneous seal to all the various O-ring sealing between those sections. So it's a little bit fiddly, that one. But with that together, most of the work is done. So we need to put an oil box on. And we need to put a motor on. And we have a choice of what order to do all of that in, because it is possible to bolt the pump together. So we could put the motor on, check it, and just see whether we're getting suction on there. We don't have any oil in the pump mechanism, so I'm wary of doing that. What I prefer to do is assemble the whole pump based on the fact that I was careful and assembled it in what I believe to be the best manner, and then we'll go from there. So our oil box gasket is going to fit onto the pump. Like that, leaving the clearance holes through for the motor bolts. So the oil box is on. Flip it all over. Now the coupling has to sit underneath the shaft seal. I didn't put it in before because I know that it's possible to just pop it through fairly carefully. Otherwise it'd be rattling around inside there while we were trying to get all the other pieces together. So having popped it into the cavity, I just need to move it around until it lines up like that and sits down onto the two dowels on the inner rotor. And then I can just check everything's good and clean and ready, and then bring the motor up to fit. So into that deep well around the shaft will go our felt pad. Just going to eyeball that shaft. This one is really good. Don't see any problems there. So the felt can go into position. Push it down. Then we have the deep joy of trying to align these two tiny dowels into the two tiny holes that they go into. Oh, small pumps, eh? So I can see that the orientation there, it's easier to move the motor orientation than the pump, obviously. So I'm just going to rotate the shaft of the motor, and it looks like I've got a fairly good chance of it lining up. I'm going to put a dab of oil into the shaft seal and then remove the excess. And then attempt to bring those together. I might be lucky, I might not. Okay, it feels like I was. That feels like that went together correctly. So I'm going to tip it up on end, drop in my motor bolts. See what I mean? So much of this is, it feels like it went together right. It feels like it's turning smoothly. A lot of it comes down to experience. Some people have a sixth sense with engineering items. Not saying that I do. I have to make do with experience. But at that stage, see, one of the alternative things we could do here is to actually take the fan cover off here, which will allow us to turn the whole thing by hand, which with this design, because of the way that coupling is designed, it's the only way to turn it by hand. With most pumps, you have a two-part coupling that allows you to get to it much more easily. So just to illustrate what I mean there, if I whip off the fan cover, we just got didn't even use regular screws for that. Don't think that's going to come. No, we'll give up on that idea. So that's the motor fitted. We can now go for the base plate, get that reinstalled. With the base plate back on, all then that remains is to fill the pump with oil, get it over onto the test bench, see if it works. So that's our Pfeiffer DUO 2.5 all back together again. I will put it on to test, and I'll just add something on the end, tell you how it got on. So there is our Pfeiffer DUO 2.5 oil sealed rotary vane vacuum pump on the test bench at 1 × 10⁻³ millibar. The noise you can hear is firstly the bench buzzing, but also just the exhaust, just the oil gurgling that you can hear through there. So once this is all fitted back up to the machine with the exhaust ducted away, it's going to be perfect for them. Thanks for watching. If we can help you with service or spare parts, then please get in touch and check the YouTube channel for other videos and the website labvac.net for any schematic diagrams and parts that you need. Thanks.